Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to another video on the channel. In this video, I'm going to be installing my new Revesol hydro-dipped carbon fiber steering wheel that I unboxed and showed you guys in the last video on my channel. I'm really excited to get this wheel installed because it is the beginning of the process of really updating the look and feel of the interior on my C5 Corvette. So the first step is to disconnect the battery. You want the battery completely disconnected to get rid of any chance for the airbag to deploy unintentionally. Once you disconnect the battery, you want to let the car discharge down for at least 30 minutes. I let it sit for a day just to eliminate all possible chances of that airbag going off. So quickly just going over some tools. Really the key one there is the T30 Torx bit, a series of extensions, and your ratchet. And the first step to get the airbag off is you're going to want to turn the wheel about 90 degrees to the left. There's two bolts that hold the airbag to the steering wheel, and they're located at about the 9 and 3 o'clock position on the steering wheel. Anybody that says you have to remove the lower kick panel or the lower panel on the column to get these off is completely incorrect. You do not need to do that. That is more work for yourself. So it just takes a lot of finagling. It's really hard to see where the bit is being pointed and where the head of the bolt is because it's not a straight shot through. There's kind of some play to shoot the bit to the left or right, up or down of the bolt head. So it takes a lot of finagling. This was by far the longest part of this process. It took me about an hour to get these off, believe it or not. But through the course of using different extensions and setups, I finally got those bolts out. They're a really funky setup that I'll show you in more detail here in a second. And I used a magnet to get them pulled out because they got a little stuck. So this was my first setup I used. It was a T30 with a wobble extension on a ratchet. The wobble extension allowed a little bit of movement so that I could kind of get some play in there to get the Torx bit on the head of the bolt. I had to use a few different setups. I used a hex Allen key, I used that, and then I also taped the wobble extension so it didn't move. And this is what I was talking about. This is kind of your view trying to get those bolts out. You can't really see anything, and it just takes a lot of playing around. You're not really sure if the bit is on the head of the bolt or not. So it just took a lot of time. It was very time consuming. This required a lot of patience. Once you got the head of the bit on there, then you want to really hold it in place, put your ratchet on there without it falling off, and then just take it off all in one go without the bolt head falling off. A trick I used a little bit here was putting some blue painter's tape around the bit head and the extension to really firm it up because I don't have any extensions that aren't wobble extensions, so that was a little bit tricky. I thought I got that last bolt out, but it was just still threaded in a little bit, and so now I'm going on a little bit over an hour. But I finally got the airbag off, both bolts are out. So now the next process was to remove the yellow wire, which is the airbag wire. So you're going to pull up on that little tab. It's like a safety clip. And then you're going to pull that yellow wire off. And then there's a black and red wire for the horn. You do not need to cut those. Do not listen to anybody that says that. The black wire is a basic spade connector, and then the red wire is a spring-loaded push and turn connector. Don't need to cut those. And then here's a close-up shot of those two bolts that hold the airbag in. They're really interesting. I'm sure they have some special design to withstand the force when the airbag deploys. They almost look like a hollow point round if you're familiar with hollow point rounds and firearms and whatnot. So now the next step, I got the airbag out, so I was just trying to get the wheel centered. It's not critical that you do this based on the design of the splines on this wheel. But now you can see kind of the setup. So now we got to get that center nut off of the threaded part of the steering column shaft. Again, not critical that you line it up. The design of the splines was basically allows the wheel only to go on one way. I decided to mark this with a Sharpie anyways, and it came in handy later in the video, which I'll discuss in more detail. But I basically marked the point on the wheel where it was at center, and it was kind of funny. There's an arrow into the casting of the wheel, and then that same mark I transferred to the nut on the steering shaft. So you're going to use a 13/16 socket to get the nut off. I prefer to use a breaker bar because it's a little bit more even and gentle torque versus an impact wrench, and it came right off no problem. So essentially my goal for this video is to provide some kind of insider tips and tricks that I didn't see in any other videos that I watched. I pretty much watched every single C5 Corvette steering wheel removal video on YouTube, and no one really touched on exactly why these get stuck. They're notorious for getting stuck and really hard to remove, or sometimes they come right off. You can see in this case, mine didn't come right off after pulling the knot off. I was putting some decent force on it. I was flexing the whole wheel and column, but it was stuck. So the first tip is apply some thread penetrant. In this case, I used standard good old WD-40, and take the nut off completely and let that thread penetrant soak down into the splines of the steering wheel. And I'll explain why that's important in a little bit. And you want to let that thread penetrant sit and soak for at least a day and douse it a few different times. I applied a little towel to the lower part of the steering wheel so it didn't run everywhere and make an absolute mess. But you really want that thread penetrant to get down in the splines. The second tip is it sounds weird, but use a hammer and tap the inner hub of the steering wheel. Kind of felt like Jeremy Clarkson from Top Gear a little bit.
Sophisticated toolkit.
But if you've ever removed a ball joint, you'll know that using a mallet, a soft blow mallet, doesn't always work, but using a hammer to jolt the ball joint, it pops right off sometimes. Using that hammer, I was thinking that would help jolt the binding of the splines with the steering wheel and the steering column. Now I'm showing you guys the critical tool that you need, absolutely need to do this. Get this tool. Don't try and use a standard universal 3-jaw puller. There's a specific steering wheel puller tool for the it's not for the C5 Corvettes, but it is a steering wheel puller that has these J hooks that I'm showing here, and those are critical to doing this the right way. Those J hooks are designed, and there's cutouts in the steering wheel, rectangular cutouts for those J hooks to go in, and then they rotate 90 degrees in these special little pockets that I'll show you once I get the stock wheel pulled off. So you want to get those. Get the steering wheel puller that has these. Because all these pieces are just cast, there's a little bit of a flashing left over from the cast, so I had to use a file and file down that flashing so that they fit a little bit easier into those rectangular cutouts, because you have to insert it in the rectangular cutout and then rotate them 90 degrees to get in the special pockets designed for being able to remove the wheel. So what I'm doing now is I threaded the nut back onto the steering column just a little bit, so when this thing comes off, it doesn't fly off and hit me in the face. And then I'm working to just test fit these J hooks in the little pockets and rotate them accordingly. With my particular column puller tool or steering wheel puller tool, you have to put it through the actual tool. You can't just slide it in through the side, so you have to kind of do this all in one go. It's a little bit quirky, kind of wants to fall all over the place, but you kind of just have to hold it in place as you thread that centerpiece down and get some tension on it. And that was really my biggest challenge with this, was the steering wheel puller, the centerpiece wanted to walk off of the nut. And it kept kind of going all sideways and cockeyed when I would apply pressure with the ratchet trying to get this thing off. So I had to put the nut on and back the nut off just a little bit so that it basically held the puller in the middle on the shaft a little bit. And yes, I am wearing sunglasses because I have seen people do this, and the chunks of the steering wheel can sometimes fly off if it's really stuck on there, so obviously don't want anything to hit my eye. And this is where I was having issues with it walking off the centerpiece, so I was just kind of readjusting it. I took one of the extensions off in the middle. That's what kind of comes in the steering wheel puller kit. So then this threaded piece, still had a little bit of threads left, just enough to pull the wheel off. But the little threaded piece itself was small enough in size that it fit in between the nut on the steering shaft. So now I got this all centered. As you tighten this thing down, you want to make sure it stays square. You don't want it going all crooked on you, because then you're more likely to break the wheel instead of pulling it off with nice even force. So then I just used a 1/2-inch ratchet and slowly, keyword slowly, applied torque to the steering wheel puller tool. It takes a decent amount of force. It feels like you're going to break something, but you kind of just have to trust and keep going. If you honestly get stuck while you're doing this, or you feel like it's taking way too much force, leave the puller on and continue applying thread penetrant and tap it more with the hammer and let it sit. Over time, once you get it, or once it sits for long enough and you apply enough force, like you saw there, it'll pop off. I definitely thought I broke something at first, but after kind of backing that off, I could see that it finally broke loose. I pulled the wheel off, and this was a great moment in the project here. A lot of stress alleviated knowing I was able to get this wheel off. And I did confirm all of these tips and tricks worked because I helped a few friends do the same thing on their C5 Corvettes the week after. So what I'm showing here is those little pockets I was talking about for the J-hooks. You basically thread them in, and then on the right side you rotate it up, on the left side you rotate it down. And so it's critical that those J-hooks pull on that part of it and not anywhere else, because if you're trying to pull on the sides, it's going to break the wheel. This is my theory right here of why these wheels get stuck. A lot of people think they're just torqued way too tightly on from the factory. I was surprised to see this, but there was actually some surface rust and corrosion on the splines of the steering column and the threads as well. But really what's important here is the splines. And the steering wheel had a little bit of corrosion on it as well, which I'm really kind of curious why that is, because this was not a flood car at all. But I just think it's uncoated steel, and it just, with ambient moisture, sometimes cars get hot and humid. I think it's just some rust builds up. So I think why these get stuck is they get kind of like rust welded with the splines, and splines are a very intricate and sensitive mating surface because of how much contact area there is. So I think that's why these really get stuck, and why the thread penetrant helps, and the tapping with the hammer helps to kind of break loose any rust welding essentially. So here are the two wheels side by side, again just showing the vast improvement of this Revesol wheel over the stock wheel. And before I put the new wheel on, one thing I wanted to do is definitely get rid of that surface rust and corrosion. So I'm taking a brass wire brush, nothing too aggressive, and just trying to get that surface rust off and clean this up a little bit. I will be applying thread lubricant later before I get this on as well. So I got a before and after picture here. So on the left is a before picture. You can see all the surface rust before brushing it, after I took the wheel off, and then on the right is after brushing it. So it definitely helped to clean that up. I'm also going to be using a little barrel brush on my drill to clean up the threads on the nut, because there was some gunk that kind of built up in the threads. I don't know if it was old thread locker or what, but I'm going to be applying new thread locker, and I didn't want that gunk in these threads to bind up and ruin the threads on the shaft. So just took this, spun the brush really slowly, and just kind of cleaned up those threads nicely. So the next step is, there's a lot of pieces on the stock wheel that you got that don't come with the Revesol wheel that you have to take off and transfer over to your new wheel. And one of them is that plastic kind of rear shroud or cover. It's attached to the center hub of the wheel with a bunch of little plastic tabs. It's a little challenging, but you have to kind of just all simultaneously push on each tab while pushing back so the tab doesn't reseat. Interesting thing I saw was this shroud had a little date stamp sticker of June 13th, 2000, which was interesting because my car was built June 22nd, 2000. So this was dated just slightly before the car went down the assembly line, which I guess makes sense. But so putting this on the Revesol wheel, it's pretty straightforward. You just push it on the back side, and then those little plastic tabs grab on that center hub of the wheel, and it secures it in place. So the next piece that I'm going to be transferring over are these little metal brackets with this little plastic insulator in the middle, and that is what the airbag bolts mount into or through, and I guess that's why we have that special design on those bolts. But you definitely have to transfer these over. The Revesol wheel has nice already threaded boss features on the casting of the wheel, so it's pretty easy just to take these out and transfer them over. Make sure you get them started, I'd say, with a little wrench but first, so you don't cross or anything. And then the last thing to transfer over, these little rubber bump stops, which I think prevent the airbag and horn from rattling against the wheel. And so these are a little tricky. You just have to pull them very gently and hope that they don't break. They're just made out of rubber, and you just have to pull on them, and then they have little tails on them that you use to pull it back through the hole on the new wheel. So like I said, I'm going to be applying some ARP thread lubricant, putting it on the splines of the new steering wheel, and then I'm going to be applying it also a little bit on the splines and threads on the shaft itself. The one thing you don't want to get it on is this back kind of area of the shaft. I think that's where the electrical pieces on the wheel make connection with the clock spring, so I don't think you want to get thread lubricant on that and possibly interfere with that electrical connection there. So definitely just put it on the splines and the threads for the nut on the steering shaft. This stuff gets everywhere, so make sure you have plenty of paper towels handy. So like I said, after doing this on my car, I had a few friends that they needed to do the same thing on their C5 Corvettes. Some just chose to put a quick release steering wheel on. So I used the same methodology that I use in this video, and it seemed to work no problem. So that's 3 instances of getting a wheel off on these cars with little to no issues. So I think my methods work, but definitely give these a try if you're trying to do this at home. So next, getting the wheel seated back on the steering column. There's basically a keyway and a cutout on the spline of the shaft and the spline of the steering wheel itself, so you can basically not install it the wrong way. So there's no need to perfectly center the wheel and make sure you get it on exactly center, but that Sharpie mark still did come in handy. So I am putting a little bit of blue thread locker on this nut, just because even though I'm going to be torquing it down, you want to make sure this thing does not back off, because that would be a bad day. So I did watch a quick Chris Fix video, and I believe he said to torque this nut down to 30 foot-pounds. I had some issues with my torque wrench. I just have a cheapy torque wrench from Harbor Freight. I love Harbor Freight, but calibrated tools like that, I think I need to go a little bit for the more primo brands. I was not getting my torque wrench to click, and it was definitely feeling like it was exceeding 30 foot-pounds, so I didn't want to risk stripping any threads, pulling any threads. So this is where that Sharpie mark came in handy. So I got it pretty well snug, and then I realigned the Sharpie mark on the nut to the Sharpie mark on the wheel, and that kind of just confirmed my rotational position to get me basically about the same torque, since the wheels are the same exact size, so the spacing off of the shaft is going to be the same. So lastly here, getting the airbag put back on the wheel. Make sure you seat that yellow airbag connector firmly down and then press on it firmly with that clip to lock it in place. First time I did it, the yellow thing popped off, so you don't want to have that pop off after you get the wheel installed, because or the airbag installed, because then you'll get an airbag light. And then you're going to put the black spade connector on for the ground, and then the red spring connector for the positive or power wire for the horn. And then lastly, this was a method that I used to help get these airbag bolts threaded back in to this kind of blind area, was use some blue tape, wrap it around your wrench of choice and the head of the fastener, and then that kind of helps to hold the fastener onto the wrench. And then obviously once you get it threaded in there and you're getting to the point where you kind of have to cinch it down and with enough force, that blue tape will just break loose, and then you can pull out your wrench no problem. But this, again, it was one of the most tedious parts of the job, because you really can't see anything. You have to do everything by feel. I had to switch around between using an Allen hex wrench and then using, again, a T30 just standard ratchet with even a wobble extension onto an adapter for a 1/4 inch. So there are just a bunch of different adapters that I had to use. So you might have to try the same thing, just see whatever works for you. And that concludes that. So we got the wheel on, getting it nice and centered, and I wanted to take a seat in the car, see what it felt like for the first time. And I mean, it's just crazy how much, I mean, it makes sense, because the steering wheel is one of the most highly touched surfaces on the inside of the car, so it's just something that you want to make sure is nice and premium. Such an upgrade over the stock wheel, and for the price, I believe it was like $275 at the time of this video. It's such a bang for your buck upgrade that I highly recommend to anybody with not just a C5 Corvette. Revesol makes steering wheels for all different kinds of cars beyond Corvettes. So definitely give them a check out if you're interested in getting a new wheel for your car or truck. And it's just the start of the process for updating the look and feel of the interior on my C5 Corvette. Here's a quick little comparison of the stock to the the Revesol one. And it's just such a major upgrade. You got the flat bottom, the reinforced 9 3 sideball string, and it's just an overall better feeling and looking wheel with the red stitching and the red stripe to match the rest of the car. So that's going to do it, guys, but before I go, here's a little quick sneak peek at what's coming in the next video that continues on the interior improvement on my C5 Corvette. Thanks, guys, for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe for more videos to come, Other than that, I'll see you guys in the next one.